Ethan stood in his garden, his heart racing, staring at the destruction before him. The green beans he had nurtured for months now lay trampled in the mud, crushed beneath the wheels of a bulldozer. A group of HOA officers stood nearby, watching, with arms crossed, their expressions cold and disapproving. "You can't do this!" Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse with frustration. His chest heaved as the sweat of the day mingled with the stinging anger coursing through his veins. "This is my garden. I've worked hard for it." Linda, the HOA president, stepped forward, her posture stiff and unwavering. She looked at him with a mix of contempt and superiority. "You were warned, Ethan. Your garden is unsightly, and it violates the community codes. We have every right to remove it. But it's not just for me." Ethan's voice cracked. "I'm trying to grow food. I'm trying to show people that we can be independent. We don't need to rely on supermarkets. Don't you get it?" Linda scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. "This isn't a commune, Ethan. This is a neighborhood. We have standards, and your project doesn't fit into them." Ethan's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. The garden he had built over the course of the last year was his small act of rebellion against the corporate system. It was his declaration of independence. When he had lost his job in the spring of 2019, his world had collapsed, but he had refused to be broken. Instead, he turned to the earth. He started planting vegetables, herbs, and flowers, anything he could grow. He did. It wasn't just a way to save money. It was his way of taking control. Now, all of that was being destroyed. And for what? For nothing more than a few lines on a property code. His fists clenched, and a surge of adrenaline shot through him. This was more than just a fight for his garden. This was a fight for his freedom, for the future of a community that he believed could thrive outside the control of corporate interests. "What are you really after, Linda?" Ethan's voice grew quieter, more intense. "Is this about the garden? Or is there something more going on here?" Linda's expression faltered for a split second, a slight twitch in her eye, before she quickly regained composure. "This is about following the rules, Ethan," she replied sharply, her tone defensive, but her eyes betrayed her. "You can't go against the HOA. We enforce the community standards." Ethan studied her for a moment, the tension in the air palpable. There was something more to her words, something beneath the surface, but he couldn't place it. As he glanced at the bulldozer, its engine rumbling ominously behind him, a suspicion started to form in the back of his mind. The whole situation seemed wrung excessive, even. They didn't need to destroy his garden. They could have fined him, asked him to trim it back, or imposed some other form of compliance. But no, they had brought in heavy machinery to obliterate everything he had worked for. "Tell me the truth," Ethan demanded. "What's really going on here?" Before Linda could respond, Ethan's neighbor, Gary, who had been watching the exchange from his front porch, stepped forward. He had been quiet up until this point, but now he carried a stack of papers, his face grim. "You're not the only one with questions, Ethan," Gary said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his eyes shifting between Gary and Linda. "What are you holding?" Gary flipped open the folder and handed Ethan a set of property records. "This," Gary said, "is the official map of the neighborhood. Your garden isn't just on any random piece of land. It's on a plot that the HOA itself set aside as public green space for the entire community. It was supposed to be a park for kids to play, a place for neighbors to come together. And now," he trailed off, eyes narrowing as he turned toward Linda. "Now it looks like they want to sell it off." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The documents in his hands were a slap of reality. His garden wasn't just a patch of land. It was part of a much bigger plan, one that had nothing to do with the well-being of the community. As Ethan absorbed the information, the pieces started to fall into place. Linda's previous coldness suddenly made sense. She wasn't just protecting the HOA's rules, she was protecting something else, something more lucrative. The construction. A developer who stood to make millions from clearing the land and turning it into more luxury homes. Ethan's fingers gripped the papers tighter. "You were going to destroy this whole neighborhood for profit," he muttered, almost to himself. For a few more houses, Linda's face hardened, and for the first time, Ethan saw the full extent of her desperation. "You don't understand," she said, her voice strained. "This is bigger than you, bigger than me. This is about progress." No, Ethan shot back, shaking his head. This is about greed. The confrontation stood in a tense silence for a moment, broken only by the distant sound of the bulldozer's engine humming behind him. Ethan stood tall, his voice steady now as he realized that this wasn't just about his garden anymore. This was a fight for something more: the truth, the community, and the future they all had to share. But as Linda took a step back, signaling the workers to continue, Ethan knew this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Ethan stood frozen, his mind reeling from the discovery. The once peaceful suburban street, lined with cookie-cutter homes, now seemed like a battleground, the tension hanging thick in the air. The sound of the bulldozer's engine continued to hum like a clock counting down to something inevitable. His hands trembled as he clenched the property records tighter, feeling the weight of what this all meant. Linda, who had seemed so confident before, now stood with an expression that betrayed her growing unease. "Ethan, this is over. It's time for you to let go," Linda said, her voice forced and mechanical. "You've had your chance to comply, but this is beyond your garden. Now, you're making things worse for everyone." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "You're making things worse, Linda. You're using the HOA as a front to destroy everything this neighborhood was supposed to stand for. For what? Money? Development?" Linda's face tightened, and she shot a quick glance at the workers. "You don't understand," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "We've all been given instructions. This is what has to be done." The words echoed in Ethan's ears, but his focus remained on her, a woman he had once trusted to uphold the community's interests, who now seemed nothing more than a puppet in a game he couldn't yet understand. His frustration boiled over, and his voice became more forceful. "What instructions? Who gave them to you, Linda? Who's really behind this?" But Linda didn't answer. Instead, she waved her hand dismissively and turned toward the bulldozer operator. "Keep going," she ordered. The workers seemed to hesitate for a moment, but as soon as the bulldozer moved forward again, Ethan's heart sank. In the distance, he could see his neighbors, some of them standing on their porches, watching with a mixture of curiosity and apathy. Not a single one came forward to stand with him. His eyes briefly met Gary's, but his neighbor only looked away, not daring to interfere any further. Ethan's stomach churned at the thought of the silence that seemed to envelop his entire. Where were the people who had once shared meals, laughed together, and worked on projects? He turned back to Linda, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to let this stand, not now, not ever. "You're making a mistake," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not going to back down. I'll take this as far as I have to." Linda crossed her arms, her face filled with that same self-satisfied look of authority. "You? The HOA is within its rights to remove your garden." Ethan was well aware of the HOA's power. They had been dictating the rules of the neighborhood for years, enforcing petty regulations and maintaining the illusion of order. But what Linda didn't understand was that this wasn't about a garden. This was about something much bigger. The HOA had become a tool for something far more insidious, an entity that would stop at nothing to get what it wanted. "I'm not. I'm fighting for what's right. And the truth is, what you're doing here is wrong." Linda gave him a mocking smile. "You'll lose. They always do." Just then, Ethan felt a tap on his shoulder. He spun around to see Gary standing there, his expression grim but determined. "Ethan, I need to show you something," Gary said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think you need to see this before you make any more decisions." Confused but trusting Gary, Ethan followed him away from the bulldozer and the increasingly tense scene. They ducked behind Gary's garage, out of earshot of the HOA officers. Legal contracts and property deals, all pointing to the same thing. Linda's husband, a local real estate developer, had quietly secured plans to build new houses on the very land where Ethan's garden now stood. The project had been approved under the guise of community improvement, but it was clear to Ethan now that the goal was to line the pockets of those at the top. Gary's voice dropped even lower. "They've been planning this for months. And it's not just your garden, they want the whole lot cleared." But your garden was the perfect excuse to start. Ethan stared at the papers, his blood running cold. He could feel the anger rising in him again, hotter this time. This wasn't about community standards. This was about money. Linda had been using the HOA to push through her husband's development plans, making sure the neighborhood was cleared of anything that could get in the way. "This is what it's really about, isn't it?" Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he felt the enormity of the situation sinking in. "Greed. You're destroying this whole place just for a few more houses." Gary's face twisted with disgust. "It's not just the houses, Ethan. They're talking about luxury homes, overpriced and out of reach for most of us. They're not doing this for the community. They're doing it for their own gain." The pieces were falling into place. Ethan knew now that the battle was much bigger than just him and his garden. The fight had become a stand against everything that was wrong with this system, the HOA, the developers, and the corporate interests that had begun to take over his neighborhood. But even as he realized the stakes, he knew he couldn't let Linda or anyone else push him down. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I'm not going to let this happen, Gary. We have to fight back." Gary nodded. "I'll help you, but you're going to need more than just documents. You need support from the people here." As Ethan looked out toward the neighborhood, he realized how true those words were. Without the people's support, this was going to be a hard fight. But one thing was clear. Now he wasn't going down without a battle. The fight for his garden had turned into a fight for his community's soul, and he would do whatever it took to save it. Ethan stood outside, his hands still clutching the stack of documents Gary had given him, his mind racing as memories of the past few years flooded back. His fingers grazed the edges of the papers, but they felt heavy, like they were carrying the weight of more than just legal documents. They carried the weight of everything he had built with his own two hands, everything that was now on the line. It was early spring of 2019 when everything had started to unravel for Ethan. He had been working as a software engineer at a tech company, a job he had been proud of until the layoffs hit. Hundreds of employees were let go, and Ethan, along with dozens of his colleagues, had walked out of the office that day with nothing but severance checks and uncertainty. At first, it had felt like the end of the world. The shock of losing his job, the financial strain, and the fear of what came next to all weighed on him. But it also lit something inside him. The thought of relying on others for his livelihood, of handing over control to a system that could discard him so icily, felt wrong. He'd always been a resourceful person, but this was different. The corporate world had chewed him up and spit him out. And now, as he looked at the documents in his hands, he saw how that system was trying to do the same thing to his community. In the summer of 2019, after spending weeks in a haze of job applications and disappointment, Ethan did something unexpected. He planted his first garden. It started small, just a few herbs and vegetables on the small patch of land behind his house. But soon, it became a much bigger project. He started growing tomatoes, cucumbers, carrots, even beans. And it wasn't just about food. It was about reclaiming something for himself. It was about survival, independence, and sustainability in a world that seemed to be pushing everyone further apart. Every morning, Ethan would tend to his garden, watching as the plants slowly took root and grew. It became a routine, a lifeline in the midst of everything falling apart around him. The neighborhood, with its rows of neatly manicured lawns and pristine landscaping, seemed to mock him at first. It was a place where everything was controlled, regulated, and kept in perfect order. But to Ethan, it felt hollow. The people here followed the rules, never questioning the system in place. He, on the other hand, was learning to question everything. He started talking to his neighbors about his garden, how he was growing his own food, how they could do the same, and how they didn't have to rely on grocery stores or big corporations to eat. At first, his neighbors had smiled politely but ignored him. Some of them had even looked at him like he was crazy. "What's the point of all that dirt and weeds?" they had said. "You've got a store just down the street." But as the months passed, things started to change. Other people began to show interest. They would ask questions about the tomatoes, the lettuce, and the herbs he was growing. They'd ask for advice on starting their own gardens, and slowly, the neighborhood began to shift. Ethan wasn't just growing food, he was planting an idea. He believed that if people could take control of something as basic as what they ate, maybe they could start questioning other parts of their lives too. Maybe they could see that they didn't have to live by the rules set for them by an unseen hand. The neighborhood, once neatly divided into small boxes, had started to feel a little more connected, a little more alive. People were talking, sharing tips, and even exchanging produce. But as Ethan became more invested in his garden, and the idea of self-sufficiency, the HOA became more involved in monitoring him. At first, it was just a quiet warning reminders about keeping the lawn neat and trimming the bushes. Then, they started coming after his garden, citing code violations and complaints from neighbors who, it seemed, didn't like the look of his rows of vegetables. Ethan hadn't been surprised when the HOA knocked on his door that first time. He had expected it. What he hadn't expected was how deeply they would push. They came with a list of demands, threatening fines and legal action if he didn't rip up his garden. Their reasoning: the plants didn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood. They were unsightly, out of place. At that moment, something inside Ethan snapped. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about standing up for something bigger. The HOA wasn't just controlling his property, it was controlling everyone's choices. It was forcing people to conform, to look the same, to follow a script that kept them complacent. Ethan realized that he wasn't just fighting for his right to grow food. He was fighting for the right to live differently, to break free from the suffocating conformity that the HOA and the corporate world thrived on. In that flash of understanding, Ethan knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to back down. The garden was just the beginning. His fight was about breaking free from a system that had become corrupted and was now destroying everything he had fought to build. The plants, the food, the very idea of growing something for himself had become a symbol. And if the HOA thought they could take that away from him, they were gravely mistaken. Now, with the bulldozer just a few feet away from his garden, Ethan's determination solidified. This wasn't just about a few tomatoes or cucumbers anymore. It was about taking back control, not just of his own life, but of the life of the entire community. And the more he thought about it, the more certain he became he wasn't going to let Linda and the developers take that away from him. Not without a fight. The bulldozer revved its engine again, louder this time, its massive treads stirring up dust and debris. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched the machine inch closer to his garden, to everything he had worked for over the past year. He could feel his heart pounding in his throat, the heat of the moment pressing against his chest. He stepped forward, placing himself directly in the path of the bulldozer, his body trembling with both fear and determination. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice hoarse from the weight of his emotions. "You can't do this. This is my land, my garden. I've worked too hard for this, to just let you destroy it." The operator of the bulldozer paused, glancing over at Linda, who stood at a distance, arms crossed. She didn't speak immediately, her face hard with the same coldness that had defined her throughout this entire ordeal. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to enforce, to make Ethan's life as miserable as possible. "I've told you." "Already, Ethan," Linda said, her voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt. "This is what's best for the neighborhood. You've made your point. Now it's time for you to leave. You're not going to change anything." Ethan shook his head, his anger bubbling up uncontrollably. "You're wrong, Linda," he spat, his eyes locking onto hers with fiery intensity. "It's not just about a garden. It's about a community. It's about freedom. You can't just bulldoze everything people have worked for just to line your pockets." A tense silence followed. For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the bulldozer engine waiting for orders. Ethan's chest rose and fell rapidly as he stood his ground, his feet planted firmly in the dirt. He knew he couldn't let them intimidate him. If he backed down now, everything he had fought for would be gone, not just his garden, but the idea that people could stand up to a corrupt system. He could feel the eyes of the other neighbors on him, watching the standoff unfold. But no one stepped forward to support him. They were too scared. Too wrapped up in the safety of their conformity to challenge the system. Ethan's gaze shifted to Gary, who was standing off to the side, arms crossed, and a solemn expression on his face. Gary had been quiet since handing Ethan the documents earlier, but it was clear he knew just how high the stakes were. He understood what was happening, but even Gary wasn't stepping forward, not yet. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew that he couldn't take this fight on alone, and the weight of that truth settled heavily on him, but he wasn't backing down. Not now, not when everything he believed in was on the line. "Linda," he called out, his voice calm now, but full of purpose. "I know what you're really doing here. I know about the deal with the construction company. I know your husband's company is behind this whole thing." For a split second, Linda's face faltered, just a flash of vulnerability. She hadn't expected him to know. Ethan saw the change in her expression, and it fueled his resolve. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. "You're trying to sell this land to developers, aren't you?" Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger. "You're trying to get rid of the last green space in this neighborhood so you and your husband can profit off of it. Well, I'm not going to let you, not without a fight." Linda's composure shattered for a moment. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice rising in desperation. "You don't understand how hard this is." For me, Ethan took a step forward, closing the gap between them, his eyes never leaving hers. "I understand perfectly," he said quietly. "You're not fighting for the neighborhood, you're fighting for money, and you'll destroy everything in your path to get it." Her lips trembled as she tried to maintain her icy demeanor, but Ethan could see the cracks forming. The pressure was building, and she was starting to realize that she couldn't control the situation anymore. Ethan's heart raced as he turned to face the bulldozer operator. "If you start that thing, I'll make sure everyone knows what's really going on here. I'll go public. I'll call the news, the police, anyone who will listen. You won't get away with this." The operator hesitated, his eyes shifting nervously from Ethan to Linda. The tension in the air was palpable. The weight of the moment felt like a tug of war, a battle between the power of a corrupt system and the determination of one man who had had enough. Linda's voice cut through the silence, sharp and cutting. "Do you think anyone will believe you, Ethan?" she said with a sneer. "You're just one person, against me, against all of us. You'll be the one to lose." But just as Linda finished speaking, something unexpected happened. Gary stepped forward, standing beside Ethan, his face determined, his posture firm. "I'll stand with him," Gary said quietly, but with conviction. "I've seen the documents. I know what's happening here. This isn't just about a garden. It's about greed, and I won't stand by and let it happen." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The mood shifted as more neighbors, those who had been too scared to speak out, began to stir. Stepping off their porches and walking toward Ethan one by one, they gathered around him, their presence lending weight to his cause. Linda looked around in growing frustration, realizing that her grip on the situation was slipping. Her power, built on secrecy and fear, was beginning to unravel. And in that moment, Ethan understood something he hadn't fully realized before. He wasn't alone. The support of the community, the quiet voices that had been hesitant to speak out, were finally finding their courage. As Linda glared at the growing crowd, Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a surge of hope rise within him. He wasn't just fighting for his garden anymore. He was fighting for something bigger. A community united in defiance, a voice that would no longer be silenced. The standoff wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. The morning sun had risen higher, casting a harsh light over the standoff in Ethan's garden. What had started as a battle over a few vegetables had slowly transformed into something bigger, something far more dangerous. The neighborhood stood divided, but the first cracks in the HOA's armor had started to show. Ethan stood, surrounded by a handful of neighbors, each of them now looking at Linda, the once imposing HOA president, with suspicion and distrust. Linda's earlier confidence had vanished. Her face, once sharp and impervious, now betrayed a hint of panic as she tried to regain control over the situation. But it was too late. The cat was out of the bag, and Ethan wasn't about to back down. The crowd that had gathered around Ethan seemed to grow with every passing moment. It was no longer just about his garden. It was about everything the HOA had been hiding. The document Gary had given him, a simple piece of legal paper, had turned the entire situation on its head. Ethan could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, their doubts slowly turning into support. "Linda, you can't hide this anymore," Ethan said firmly, his voice cutting through the mounting tension. "We know what's going on. We know about your husband's connection to the development project. We know that this garden wasn't just a problem for you, it was an obstacle in your way." The words seemed to hit Linda harder than Ethan had expected. Her eyes flickered nervously as she glanced toward her colleagues who had been silent throughout this entire exchange. They weren't sure what to do either. For the first time, they seemed like pawns in a game they didn't fully understand. Linda, too, seemed trapped by the web of her own making. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice shaky now, her usual control slipping further. You have no idea what you're up against." "I think it's you who doesn't understand, Linda," Ethan replied, standing tall. "You've spent years using the HOA to control this neighborhood, but now the truth is out. You can't hide behind your position anymore." For a moment, the crowd stood still, waiting for Linda's next move. Ethan could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, silently weighing the consequences of their involvement. Many of them had always been passive, unsure of whether to speak up or follow the rules. But now, the lines had been drawn. "You don't know what this means," Linda muttered again, her eyes darting around the group of neighbors, as if searching for an escape. Her voice was quieter now, strained. "This is beyond me. You think I'm the problem? You don't know the kind of pressure we've been under." Ethan narrowed his eyes. The pieces were coming together, but there was still one thing he needed: to know how far this went. He stepped closer to Linda, lowering his voice to make sure only she could hear. "Who's really pulling the strings, Linda?" Ethan asked. "It's not just you, is it? You don't have the power to make these decisions on your own. Who else is involved?" Linda hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she looked around. The facade she had carefully constructed for years was crumbling, and now, with the weight of the truth pressing down on her, she seemed on the verge of breaking. I can't," she whispered. "I can't tell you. You don't understand the consequences." Ethan took a deep breath, realizing that Linda wasn't going to spill the full truth on her own. But that didn't matter. He had enough. He had enough to start digging to expose the corruption that had infected the HOA and this entire neighborhood. And now, with the neighbors rallying around him, he wasn't going to stop. "I think we both know the truth, Linda," Ethan said, stepping back. "You were using your position in the HOA to clear the way for your husband's company. You were going to sell the land and let them build luxury homes that none of us could afford. But now, it's not just your word against mine. I've got the proof." He lifted the documents from Gary's folder again, letting them catch. The sunlight, the papers glinting in the harsh light. "You're done?" Ethan said, his voice rising as he turned to the crowd. "But we're just getting started." The neighbors, who had been standing silent for so long, now seemed to stir. A few murmurs broke out among the group. Some of them were angry, others were incredulous, but most of them were united in the realization that they had been duped. They had been under the thumb of the HOA for far too long, and now they were learning just how deep the corruption ran. Gary stepped forward, his face lined with concern but resolute. "I've been living here for over 15 years. I trusted the HOA. I thought they were looking out for us," Gary said, his voice shaking with anger. "But they weren't. They were working against us." Linda's gaze flickered nervously, and for the first time, her mask of authority faltered completely. She took a step back, her hands rising defensively, like she was trying to shield herself from what was coming. "You think you can just expose me," Linda sneered. "I can make this go away. You think the authorities will care about your little garden? You think they'll care about any of this?" Ethan held her gaze unflinching. "We'll see about that." The crowd had grown by now. People were starting to gather on their porches, peering out from behind windows, finally willing to confront the truth. The whispers of rebellion that had been simmering for months were beginning to boil over, for the first time in a long time. The neighbors were ready to take a stand, ready to hold the HOA accountable. Gary looked around at the gathered crowd. "I'm not backing down," he said, his voice full of conviction. "And neither should any of you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The hidden agenda, the corporate interests, and Linda's deceitful actions were no longer a secret. Ethan had exposed the truth. Now the question was, what were they going to do about it? Linda's face turned ashen. Her back was against the wall now, and there was nowhere left to run. She had underestimated the power of a united community, and now she was about to learn just how far the truth would take them. Ethan stood tall, feeling the weight of the fight ahead. But for the first time since this all began, he knew he wasn't alone. The tide had shifted, and they weren't going to stop until justice was served. Ethan stood before Linda, the weight of the moment pressing down on him as the crowd around them swelled with growing support. His hands were steady now, no longer shaking with anger, but with the quiet certainty of a man who knew he was on the right side of history. The energy in the air was electric, thick with the promise of change, and he could feel it in every tense breath the neighborhood took. The bulldozer was still idling in the background, but no one was focused on it anymore. The crowd had gathered, more neighbors coming out of their homes, their faces a mixture of disbelief, anger, and hope. It wasn't just Ethan standing up anymore. It was all of them. People were beginning to see what Ethan had seen months ago. The HOA, the so-called guardians of their neighborhood, had been lying to them. They had been using the system to serve their own interests, not the interests of the people they were supposed to protect. The veil was lifting, and the truth was starting to come into full view. Linda stood facing Ethan, but her shoulders were slumped now, and her posture betrayed her. The cold, authoritative figure she had once been was no more. The moment she had tried to control, to suppress, was slipping away, and she knew it. Ethan could see the cracks in her resolve. She was realizing that this wasn't just a garden anymore. It was about the power she had held over the community, the power that was now slipping through her fingers. "You think you've won?" Linda sneered, though her voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. "You think this changes anything? You think the authorities will care about some silly garden?" Ethan's gaze never wavered. "I don't need the authorities to care, Linda. We've got the truth, and the truth is stronger than any authority. We've been living in your shadow for too long, accepting your lies, but that's over now." As the words left his mouth, he could hear the murmurs of agreement from the crowd. It was happening. The shift he had been fighting for, the hope he had planted with each seed in his garden, was taking root in the hearts of those around him. Gary, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward, his eyes locked on Linda. "We've been quiet for too long," Gary said, his voice resonating with a quiet strength. "But we're not going to stay quiet anymore. We won't let you bulldoze this community. You won't tear it apart for a quick profit. Not on our watch." Linda's face contorted with frustration, her fingers gripping the folder of property, documents in her hand like a shield. She was trying to maintain control, to force a narrative that suited her. But the power was shifting. She wasn't the one controlling the story anymore. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," Linda said, her voice now pleading, a far cry from the confident tone she had used earlier. "This is bigger than all of you. I'm doing what's best for the neighborhood. You have no idea how much is at stake." Ethan took a step closer, his voice firm, yet laced with an edge of finality. "The only thing at stake here, Linda, is your greed. You've been selling us out for your husband's company, using the HOA as your personal tool. We trusted you, and now we see you for what you are." Linda's lips trembled as her eyes darted around, looking for an escape, a way out of the spotlight she had spent so many years controlling. But there was no escape now. The truth was out, and it was bigger than she could deny. Ethan's voice dropped, becoming almost a whisper, but one that carried a weight that resonated with the crowd. "You'll have to face the consequences of your actions. All of us will. We're not backing down anymore." Linda turned toward the other HOA officers who had been standing silently by, their faces tight with anxiety. They were realizing, now that they, too, had been complicit. The truth had exposed their roles in the scheme, their quiet nods to Linda's plans, their passive acceptance of her decisions. No one had questioned her. "Not until now. We'll report this." One of the neighbors, an older man named Frank, spoke up, his voice clear and unwavering. "I'm going to take everything you've done to the press. All of it. I've got copies of the documents Gary gave Ethan, and I've already spoken to a lawyer. You're not going to get away with this." The murmur of agreement spread through the crowd like a wave. The fear that had once held them all in check had begun to dissipate. The power of unity, the collective strength of a neighborhood bound together by truth, had become undeniable. Ethan glanced at Gary, who was nodding in approval. "We've got their backs now," Gary said quietly. "We won't let this go." Linda, her shoulders slumped in defeat, made one last attempt to salvage her position. "You think you can stop this? You don't understand. You're too small, too insignificant. You won't make a difference." But Ethan stood tall, his resolve unwavering. "We're not insignificant, Linda. You're the one who underestimated us. We're a community, and we're stronger than you ever thought we were." The sound of sirens in the distance interrupted their standoff, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. But it was only the beginning. The authorities, the press, everything, was about to descend on the HOA. The weight of Linda's actions, the lies she had woven, were finally going to be exposed to the world. With a final glance at Linda, Ethan turned toward the crowd. "It's over," he said, his voice filled with quiet triumph. "We've won." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Ethan could feel the gravity of the moment sink in. This wasn't just a victory for him, for his garden. It was a victory for the entire community, for all those who had been silenced, who had lived under the shadow of the HOA's power. They had fought for something more important than property. Lines and rules, they had fought for justice. As the crowd began to disperse, their energy still buzzing with the thrill of the moment, Ethan looked at his garden. The bulldozer had been stopped, its engine now silent. The plants, the flowers, the vegetables, everything he had worked for remained standing. But more than that, the community around him had changed. They were no longer just neighbors, they were allies, and together they had won. The first true breath of freedom the neighborhood had felt in years was finally in the air, and it smelled like victory. The days that followed the confrontation were nothing short of transformative for both Ethan and the entire Riverview neighborhood. What had started as a battle over a small patch of garden had blossomed into a movementa collective awakening that had shaken the very foundation of the community. The news of Linda's corruption, her connection to the construction company, and the HOA's involvement in exploiting the neighborhood had spread like wildfire. Within a week, the local news stations had picked up the story, and reporters were camped outside the HOA offices. Ready to expose the truth, Linda and the other members of the HOA who had been complicit in the scheme found themselves caught in a whirlwind of public outrage. The pressure was immense, and soon enough, investigations were launched. Public opinion had turned against them, and their once ironclad grip on the neighborhood began to loosen. Neighbors who had once been passive, complacent under the weight of the HOA's rules, were now coming together to demand accountability. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Watching this transformation unfold, the community that had been fractured, governed by fear and conformity, was starting to rebuild itself. People were no longer just following the rules, they were questioning the rules. They were talking to one another, sharing their concerns, their hopes, and their dreams for a better neighborhood. The HOA, stripped of its power and exposed for its corruption, was in disarray. Legal action was taken against Linda and the other key figures involved, and the once feared organization had been dismantled. What was once a tool of oppression had crumbled under the weight of its own lies. In its place, a new, transparent system was slowly beginning to take shape, led by a group of neighborhood representatives who were committed to rebuilding from the ground up. For Ethan, however, the most significant change was the blossoming of his garden, symbol of his fight and the heart of his mission. As the days grew longer and the weather turned warmer, the garden flourished in ways that Ethan had never imagined. His vegetables and flowers were growing taller and more vibrant, and with each new harvest, the neighborhood felt more alive. What had once been a solitary act of self-reliance had now become a shared experience, one that united people in the simple joy of growing their own food. Neighbors who had once ignored his garden now sought his advice. They asked for tips on planting, on composting, on growing food in small spaces. Some even began to start their own gardens, and soon enough, the once uniform lawns of Riverview began to show signs of individuality. There was a feeling of collective empowerment, of people taking back control of their own lives and surroundings. Ethan had become a quiet leader in the community, not because he sought the role, but because his actions had spoken louder than any words. He had shown that one person, standing up for what was right, could make a difference. He had led by example, and in doing so, had sparked a wave of change that would continue to ripple through the neighborhood for years to come. As spring gave way to summer, Ethan's garden began to take on a deeper significance. It was no longer just a place where vegetables grew. It was a place where the spirit of the neighborhood grew as well. Children played near the rows of tomatoes, cucumbers, and sunflowers. Families gathered for picnics on the lawn, sharing the fruits of their labor. The neighborhood, once divided by fear and rules, was now united by shared values of independence, sustainability, and community. One Saturday afternoon, as Ethan worked in his garden, a small group of neighbors approached him, their faces beaming with excitement. "We've been talking," said Sarah, a woman who lived 2 doors down, "and we want to start a community garden project. We've got the land behind the old schoolhouse, and we think it would be the perfect spot for everyone to come together and grow food." "What do you think?" Ethan paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, and looked up at the group. He smiled, realizing that this moment was exactly what he had hoped for when he first planted that small patch of vegetables. It wasn't just about his own garden anymore. It was about creating something that belonged to everyone. "I think it's a great idea," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Let's make it happen." In the months that followed, the community garden project grew, expanding into a thriving hub of activity. The old schoolhouse lawn was transformed into a patchwork of individual plots, each tended to by families, couples, and individuals from all walks of life. The project became a symbol of their collective strength, a reminder that when people come together, they can build something beautiful, something lasting. Ethan stood at the edge of the community garden one evening, looking out over the rows of plants that had brought so many people together. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the scene. It was a moment of quiet reflection for him. The fight had been long and hard, but in the end, it had been worth it. The garden had not only survived, it had thrived, and so had the community. Ethan had always believed that real change began with the simplest of X's seed planted in the soil, a commitment to do something different. Now, as he watched his neighbors working together, side by side, he realized that the seed he had planted in his own garden had taken root in the hearts of everyone around him. The neighborhood was no longer just a place to live. It was a community, one built on the values of mutual respect, independence, and the understanding that together they could make a difference. And as the seasons continued to change, Ethan knew that the legacy of this fight, this victory, would continue to bloom. Just like the flowers in his garden, it was a new beginning for Riverview, one that promised a future full of possibilities, and Ethan was proud to have been part of that transformation. The battle had been won, but the real victory, he realized, was just beginning.